Okay, hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to be discussing rook and pawn endgames, and I'm going to be discussing when we place the rook behind passed pawns and how that works in rook and pawn endgames and what the big advantage of that is. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. Now the interesting thing about placing rooks behind passed pawns, you hear this all the time. Rooks belong behind passed pawns. Rooks belong behind passed pawns. The interesting thing about that rule is if you go to pure rook and pawn endgames, just like rook on rook, you hardly ever see it. It doesn't mean that the rook doesn't belong behind a passed pawn. There's plenty of logical reasons that a rook belongs behind a passed pawn. I mean, as the pawn goes up the board, that pawn becomes a bulldozer. The rook can control all of the squares in front of the passed pawn. The rook that's trying to blockade that pawn will start losing scope and losing squares. But there is kind of this inherent issue. And it can be seen in this game. This game was actually played between Rubenstein and Leonhardt, played in Prague back in 1908. So going all the way back to 1908, we see Rubenstein kind of sticking to this principle of having his rook behind the passed pawn. But in almost every top-flight game where having the rook behind the passed pawn is a really great idea, and there are many, there are other pieces present on the board, either queens or a second pair of rooks, or maybe the rooks are behind two sets of passed pawns or two pawns that are connected. A lot of times it'll happen in 4-rook endgames. Basically, other pieces will be on the board. As is the case here, we still have queens on the board. And I really just wanted to show this endgame why it's actually so critical that the queens are on the board. Because, black starts defending in this position, with this passed pawn that's threatening to advance up the board like a giant bulldozer. He does what most people do. He just kind of blockades, and he sticks his rook kind of in the way of, sort of what's going on here. And then after, the pawn advances, he brings his queen back, and he's sort of trying to control this passed pawn. Now, something that I really want to note here, if we just, could magically remove the queens from the board, this passed pawn would actually just be too advanced. We would lose it. Black could really easily just play f6, king f7, king e6, and that pawn is just going to fall. We don't have enough material to hold the pawn. That's why you almost always see the rooks going behind the passed pawns. When the pros do it, when the grandmasters do it, there's other pieces on the board to help support that passed pawn. So in this position, the game continued. Rubenstein shoved that pawn all the way down there. The king came to e7, but the king is never going to be able to harvest that passed pawn because we can always just check him away with one of our other pieces. So queen g4, we're protecting our passed pawn while putting pressure on black's king side while doing other stuff. So the passed pawn is putting pressure on the position. Our rook has a lot of scope. Black's rook is passive, and that's what gives white this huge advantage, and that's why the rook belongs behind this passed pawn. And that's what's giving white this huge advantage here. Black offers the queen exchange. Now look what would happen if Rubenstein exchanged queens. If Rubenstein exchanged queens right now, queen e6, fe6, his position would be completely lost a move later after king e7 followed by rook d7. So in the pure rook endgame, just having the rook behind the passed pawn and shoving that pawn all the way up the board doesn't typically work very well. Usually in pure rook endgames, you do much better if your rook is active and you've shoved that pawn up the board as far as you can, and you've used the what I like to call the chuck and shove method, or the chuck and run method, where you chuck some pawns and you run with the ones that are further up the board. That's the correct method when you get down to just pure rook endgames. Here, white is going to have to do some fancy footwork, and he's going to have to kind of maintain his advantage and constantly threaten to advance this pawn in some sort of meaningful way, while keeping the position of his king relatively safe so he avoids perpetuals. Now, Rubenstein managed to do this, but oh boy, there was a ton of maneuvering here, because this is actually a very difficult position to win. So Rubenstein basically just tortured this guy for many moves, repeating moves 3 times on several occasions. And then finally he does exchange queens, and he advances his king because he exchanges queens in a situation where even after losing this pawn on d7, he's actually obtained a winning king and pawn endgame. And he knew that this king and pawn endgame was, in fact, winning. because he had this specific idea in mind, where he was going to bring the king up, and as you can see, he has the 2-on-1 right here, so he's going to get a passed pawn here, and if this pawn advances, both players will queen, and we end up with kind of this interesting situation. White queens first, and then he changes this into a winning queen and pawn endgame, and then the queen and pawn endgame is a win. But it was by no means a simple task to win that position just because he had the rook behind the pawn. And it was also something that was important to note. He had to have, very good technique to just kind of, press and just keep pressing. Now, the best example I've ever seen of putting the rook behind the pawn and how it works and how it can work incredibly well was actually in the World Championship match between Vladimir Kramnik and Vasilij Topalov, played back in 2006. And this was actually in the playoffs. And they got to this interesting point. Black had just played king f6, and white has 2 passed pawns. And it's this really open question. What should white's next move be? Well, actually, the principle really does apply incredibly well here. One of white's passed pawns is blockaded, but he's got this other passed pawn. What should he do? Well, he should just threaten to shove this thing all the way up the board as fast as physically possible and turn it into a juggernaut and just make it nearly impossible for black to stop it. So Kramnik played the principled move. Just rook a1, shove that rook behind the pawn. This is the traditional putting the rook behind the pawn that we all know and love. Just note that there are other pieces on the board. He's actually got a rook in front of the pawn as well. It's going to be nearly impossible for black to go ahead and blockade this pawn, but he's going to have to try. Black is going to have to try to blockade this pawn just to stop it. But already, this pawn is going to be turning into a juggernaut, and the game didn't take much longer. Kramnik won the game really kind of easily. After rook f5, he had to play f3 to defend his 7th rank. But then, after a few more moves, this juggernaut starts moving up the board. He's going to play a4, but then he's going to use his other rook to get rid of the blockaders. He's going to play rook b5. Without the other rook to get rid of the blockaders, if we were to just eliminate this down into a 2-rook endgame, we would have an incredibly hard time winning this position, because we'd have to bring our king all the way over here to get rid of those blockaders, and that would put our king out of position with other things. And that's another thing that typically happens in all of these pure rook and pawn endgames. But when there's other pieces present on the board, having that rook positioned behind that passed pawn is a seriously deadly component of the position, because you can use your other pieces to deter blockaders, get them out of the way, and shove that pawn up the board like this giant unstoppable juggernaut, and you're just pushing your pawn all the way for a win. And that's basically what Kramnik did. He just kept shoving the pawn up the board and just kept deterring blockaders at every opportunity. And eventually, he was just able to segue this into a win, because he was able to force the pawn through, because Topalov just basically lost it. He has to take one of these passed pawns. He has to get rid of this stuff. He tried a tactic. He tried rook c5. That tactic doesn't work. Rook b7 check. And of course, the issue is that we're taking absolutely everything and we're queening at the end of all this. So if, for instance, we have rook takes b7 at the end of all this, we're going to play rook takes c5 check. And now if we move our king to a square that does not attack this rook, we're simply losing this rook for absolutely nothing. But if we move the square to a king to a square that attacks the rook, when we take, this pawn is actually going to make a touchdown and it's going to make a queen. So we have no good option here. If the king stays next to the rook, now we're just down an entire rook. We would take here and we'd be down an entire rook. So the pawn was able to eventually create enough of a threat that black ended up losing a rook out of the deal, and that was why Topalov had to resign. But that's the correct method for putting a rook behind the pawn, what situations you put the rook behind the pawn, how you shove that pawn up the board and get rid of blockaders, and how you use, the principle of putting rooks behind the pawn. And that's why you always hear this basic principle repeated over and over again. Put your rooks behind passed pawns, put your rooks behind passed pawns. And in middle games and middle game transitions to end games, this is just absolutely a spectacular strategy and should be utilized all the time. In pure rook endgames, you need to look for the exceptions where the rook needs to go active. A lot of times the rook will end up in front of the pawns. A lot of times the rooks will go active, go to the 7th rank, go to the open files, find a place where they have checking distance. there's a lot of other things that rooks do in pure rook and pawn endgames that they need to do, other than just being parked behind a passed pawn under a lot of different conditions. The exceptions basically become the rule at that point. Well, anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope that you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.